interesting experience because this was in the 60s when the whole country was on fire. Everybody thinks it's a great split in the country today. Well, if you're around in the 60s, which it looks like most of you were, except for this little guy here, who happens to be my son, and he's the best, by the way. You know, but in the 60s, you know, the country really was on fire. We have a whole chapter in the South is burning, because it was. And Upton tells a lot of stories about dangers of scouting in those days down south as a young white guy in a Cadillac driving around claiming he works for the Baltimore Colts and looking like he's 12 years old. But he had one...
Not much has changed.
He had a number of really interesting experiences during that time. But one happened at Alcorn A&M. And we have this and a lot of others in the book, but I think you'll enjoy this story.
Well, for anybody to try and understand what we're seeing today and then without getting political, it's interesting. In those days, unlike today, they would give you, I was 24 years old. Now most scouts then were in their 50s and 60s. I was a kid given a chance by Carol Rosenblum, the owner, and also Don Shula. And so they would say, here are 30 brochures, it's February, don't come back to June. And I'm saying, Jesus, what the hell am I going to do? There was no advance, you know, this guy is coming to the school and that is coming to school. But I remember my first time going into Mississippi. I crossed the border. And in those days, there were no superhighways. So you went from place to place to place. And you got to know, you could go 5 miles from the town you were just in, and their opinions and their look at life was completely different. You get the grits and you get the breakfast. In one town, they might like you, in the other town, they might not. But I remember crossing the border into Mississippi, and I was stopped by the police because I looked like what the guy said at the window, which is basically, are you one of them white integrators? They're coming here to register the N-word, to vote. And I said, no. I barely got my card out when the guy basically said, if you're one of them, you will disappear quickly. And the reality of it was, too, that he also said, you know, we are still hanging people here. This is 1963. So don't think it's disappeared. Well, it's disappeared, but everybody thinks of it as modern times. They were still hanging people when I went through the South. And I can remember, I was telling Ron, getting up many days, Mississippi, Alabama, all the way through across the border into Texas, Louisiana, all the way out west, but particularly in the South. And by the way, this isn't particularly a knock at it. I'm just telling you what happened. Is I would get up most days and say, I hope I live through the day. And that is maybe quite a shock to people think that pro football, at least then, was very glorious. But the greatest players, and what changed my whole opinion about what life is like. Today, the NFL is 80%, roughly around there, African American. When I started out, it might have been 30%, maybe. But what I saw, and because I was so young and not inured with what the older scouts did, is that I would go to campuses out in the middle of nowhere. Prairie View, A&M, Alcorn, A&M, Grambling, all of these different places. And it kind of dawned on me, Jesus, the white players at Alabama are not as good as the guys that are running on dusty fields in Prairie View. And one of them, who belongs in the Hall of Fame, that made the great catch in the last Super Bowl before the merger, was Otis Taylor of the Kansas City Chiefs. Remember him? Yep. I saw this guy, it was night. There was no meals. They served them orange drinks and a sandwich. There were no cameras or nothing. The field was dusty. And I remember the coach was running all of these different kind of patterns, and I said, "Who's that guy?" And he said, "It's Otis Taylor." And I remember coming back because people didn't believe in this. I said, "I just saw the greatest receiver I ever saw. He's out in the middle of nowhere." And they said, "What's his name?" I said, "Otis Taylor." He later, which we're going to get into in a minute, became the focal point for one of the great stories of the NFL-AFL wars before the merger, and how he was stolen out of a hotel room and put on a private plane by Lamar Hunt to steal him from the NFL. The stories are incredible, which we should get into. But I will tell you this, I learned a lot about life other than pro football. I learned the attitudes not only in the South, but the attitudes about African-American players, where an Otis Taylor today, he might be the first pick in the draft. Then it was, he's great, but he's black, maybe we'll take him in the 6th round. There's the difference.
Right, and the story we tell there was during the AFL-NFL wars, which Upton was in the middle of with the Colts, trying to steal guys and hide them away in hotel rooms because both leagues would draft them, and whoever signed them first. So there were a lot of battles over these top players, and Otis was one of those guys, and Upton was sent many times to hide guys away. But I happen to know the Otis Taylor story very well because a guy named Lloyd Wells, who I got to be pretty friendly with years later, because he began to work for Don King in boxing, and so I first met him there. But his nickname was Down and Out when he was a scout, because he was down and out. And he was the head of the curve. And his job, he worked for the Chiefs and Hank String, and his job, the year Otis Taylor was coming up, to hide Otis Taylor, get him away from the Dallas Cowboys before they can sign him. Unfortunately for Lloyd, he lost track of Otis, and he couldn't find him. But he did know Otis's mom and his sister, and he called them up and he said, "I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to lose my Cadillac, I'm going to lose everything if I can't find Otis." So they finally told him where the Cowboys were holding him in a hotel. Otis is in there, and he's in the bathroom, and he hears a knock on the window, and there's Lloyd looking through the window. He says, "You got to get out." And he said they got 2 guys in front of the doors. They literally had 2 guys in front of the door. So Otis says, "Well, what do you mean?" He says, "I'm going to lose my car, my Cadillac, but I'll give it to you if you get in the car." So that sounded good to Otis. So out through the bathroom window he goes, gets in the car, they roar away. He signs a contract with the Kansas City Chiefs. 4 years later, he scores a touchdown, the most important touchdown, and some would say one of the most important touchdowns in football history, to beat the Minnesota Vikings in Super Bowl IV, so that the AFL and the NFL forever will be tied 2-2 in Super Bowls, because the merger began right after that. And it just is obviously a completely different time and place, and a lot of what we talk about in this book. But the underneath part of it is all the same. They'll do anything for talent. You got talent. Dante Scarnecchia, the line coach we all know with the Patriots, one of the greatest assistant coaches in history, was a good friend of mine. And for a brief period of time, which everybody's forgotten, he left here and he was coaching with the Colts, because Ron Meyer, who had been fired here, had gone out there and he brought the staff with him. And there had been sort of a team uprising, which some of the longtime Patriot fans will probably recall. It was part of the reason that Meyer got fired. John Anna was against him, and Stan Morgan was against him, a lot of these guys. So I went out to do a story on them, and I was with Scar. We were walking out to the afternoon practice at training camp. And players are walking and running out there. And this player comes by, and he whacks me in the butt and laughs, and it runs off and laughs. And I looked up, and I looked at Scarnecchia, and I said, "Is that Stanley Morgan?" He goes, "Yeah." I said, "Isn't he one of the guys who ran you out of New England?" He goes, "Yeah." I said, "What's he doing here?" He said, "Man, we're football coaches. We're all whores for talent." I've never, ever forgotten that story. And that's how it was in the 1940s, and that's how it was when Upton was hiring players, and that's how it is today.
Well, and it's one of the things there, again, for 3 or 4 years, I mean, people wouldn't believe this. I've talked to people who said, there's so many different movies we could do on this for HBO and everything else, because what you see today is a very slick product It's still football, but it's a slick product. But up till maybe 1990, maybe a little bit before, it was the Wild West. I got a guy who ended up signing with me. I had gone to Atlanta, and there's a player by the name of Ted Davis, terrific linebacker, a player in the head, and was taken off the last couple of days by the head coach, Bobby Dodd. But my assignment was to go down there and keep him and 4 other players occupied for 4 days so we could then sign them. The war was going on, and I'll tell you how much money was spent. Millions of dollars, because the NFL and Pete Rozelle had hired a group, including the president of Marlboro Cigarettes, to put these ex-agents all over the country. And you know who was one of the chief ones? The head, Ed King, your former governor, who had originally been a player with the Colts, but was Massport's chief guy. Ed King was hiding players for the NFL. And you know, it's really hard to believe. So I was there with 4 or 5 players in Atlanta. And I finally, after 4 days, I filled the bathtub with all sorts of beer and everything else like that. No women, a lot of beers and stuff like that, to try and keep them going until the draft day. I finally convinced Don Shula that Ted Davis, even though he kicked somebody in the head, would be the perfect guy for us. If he kicks them in the head, let's get him to kick the Bears in the head. So how did I get him to sign? Not the money. He said, my whole life, I've come from a poor family. I just want a goddamn manicure. If you will pay for my manicure, I will sign with the Colts. So I had the contract there, and the person was working on his nail. And I finally said, all right, you son of a bitch. And he got the nails, signed. That's how we got him to sign the contract. I mean, Ron will tell you, Ron Wolf, who's now in the Hall of Fame, with Harry Shue in Las Vegas. Tell him this story. I mean, yeah, people would not believe this, and it's in the book.
Yeah,